9 books this month, which is a pretty solid start to the first month of this year when I'm trying to read 100 books for the first time, I think, ever in 1 year. I don't think I've ever read 100 books in 1 year. So 9 books is a pretty solid start. Anyway, I read 7 standard form novels and 2 manga. And out of the 7 novels, 6 were fantasy and 1 was sci-fi, and 6 were young adult and 1 was adult. So I'm going to talk about them from my lowest reviewed book to my highest reviewed books. So my lowest reviewed book this month was Furyborn by Claire Legrand, which I really wanted to like, but I ended up giving it 1 star. And up until I finished my most recent book that I finished this month, I thought my problem with the book was the lack of tension and stakes and the really predictable plot twist. And when I've had the time to reflect on the book, those are not actually the core problems to the novel. The problem the novel has, in my opinion, really comes down to 2 things. The first is that the prologue cuts a lot of the tension from one of the viewpoint characters, Riel's plotline. It sort of spoils any tension her plotline could have had in the first novel, and it also ruins the plot twist, in my opinion. I think some problems in the book could have been solved if the author had just taken out the prologue. The prologue was the wrong choice here, just because it wasn't the best place, in my personal opinion, to start the novel. But whatever. And I'm like a prologue girl. I love a really well done prologue, but this one just, I feel like even if she had made a few tweaks and perhaps been more vague about the names that she gave us in the prologue, it would have been better. But I don't know. And then I read another book later on in the month that had low to no stakes, honestly, and no real plot twist slash any plot twist the author might have been going for was very predictable, so the storyline came across very linear. But I gave that book 4 stars because the characters and their relationship I was invested in. Because the author took the time to write character scenes, character moments, and take time for us to be inside the character's head. The problem is that we spend so little time in Riel and Eliana's head when they aren't in a life or death, like high stakes, like conflict scene, an action scene, that we have no chance to really connect to them as characters. And we also get very few character moments and character scenes that aren't also in the middle of action. So that just goes to show, in my opinion, that a book of 90% action is not a well-paced book, nor is it the correct way to create high stakes, high tension in a book. Because we have to actually care about the characters for there to be any tension or stakes in a scene. So I really disliked Furyborn, and I had a really hard time finishing it. And I think that if I hadn't paid for the audiobook, I wouldn't have finished it, like if I had checked it out from the library. But because I had spent money on it, I finished it. My first 2-star book was actually my first book of the year, which sucks. I never like starting the year out on a low-rated book, but when I got the book, I thought I was gonna like it, and that was Brightly Burning by Alexa Dunn. I really wanted to like this book. I think regardless of if I like the book, Alexa's videos on YouTube are great content, and I think they're super useful when she is giving publishing advice. I think her publishing advice is great, and her pep talks and her harsh reality talks are vital to this industry that is in a lot of ways not transparent and very opaque. And finding her channel was the first time that I felt like I truly saw a peek behind the curtain. But Brightly Burning was not great. A lot of my problems come from Hugo, and in general, I think that Jane Eyre is not a book well adapted for a YA retelling, and especially it's not well adapted for a retelling that tries to make the Rochester character likable. It takes out a lot of the point of the book. It's also almost too long to do a accurate and faithful retelling, so unfortunately Alexa Donne had to cut out most of Jane's, or in this case Stella's, childhood and her cousins, the, you know, whatever, the Rivers, St. John, whatever, I forget their names, from Jane Eyre. That whole part after she leaves Rochester and goes to her cousins, because the way he treated her is different, and it's not necessarily a bad thing, but I like it in Jane Eyre better. And I think, I don't know, it doesn't necessarily work as well in space. I don't know, there was just something, it was admirable to try and put Jane Eyre in space, but it honestly didn't work for me. I thought that Stella lacked the magnetism and appeal and charisma of Jane, and lacked her like witty sense of banter, and trying to make Rochester a redeemable character despite the fact that he locks a woman in his attic. I don't know how doable that is, unless you completely cut out the fact that they lock a woman in the attic, and the alcoholism, and the manipulative and abusive way that Rochester leads Jane Eyre along, in order to ensure that he has her love. And so I think that it's hard to adapt that to something that's YA and does not perpetuate abusive and toxic and manipulative relationship behaviors. And so unfortunately, I just sort of fell short of the mark for me, which sucks because I really wanted to like it. And I think Persuasion is going to be a much better adaptable to YA sci-fi title. So I'm still super excited to read The Stars We Steal. I think, one, we all learn a lot after our first book, published or not, and I think that Persuasion, the source material, is just better to be adapted to YA sci-fi, and so I think The Stars We Steal has a lot more potential to be a higher rated book. So I'm still going to read it next month when it comes out. But Brightly Burning just sort of didn't quite hit the mark for me, which sucks. The second book that I rated 2 stars this month was a recent read that I will probably talk more about in my reading vlog that I think will come up, like be posted after this video, and that was Wicked Saints by Emily A. Duncan. Ugh, I really wanted to like it. Every time I pick up a YA fantasy book, I want to absolutely love it, and I didn't. I thought the world building, one of my pet peeves about YA fantasy in general is that the world building is not as robust as it is in adult, and I know it is part of the genre, but I also know that it is possible to write a YA series with good world building. And I just thought that something about Wicked Saints, I felt like it was longer, but nothing happened in all those pages. And that is not true. Things happened, but I felt like character arcs were non-existent. I didn't really know Nadia or the guy, not the prince, Seraphim, the guy who begins with an M, I can't pronounce his name, Malachi? I felt like I didn't really know them as characters. I was most connected to Seraphim, which I did not expect in the beginning, thought his character had the most interest potential, because what we see of him through Nadia's lens in the beginning is not the character we get by the end, and so I liked that. But he was the the tertiary character out of those three, and I didn't really care for the other two. And also I thought the relationship that you see unfold, not to give anything away about what characters get together, was incredibly unhealthy, toxic, manipulative, abusive. I don't love when a character falls in love with someone for no reason. One, there was no chemistry in my opinion, and there was no basis for the relationship. They didn't know each other very long to be throwing around like love and he broke my heart and whatever. And just not a healthy relationship when you get to the end. And I thought I was gonna love it because of Russia, and it just sounded really interesting, and people just hyped this book up, and it just really fell flat for me, and I'm really on the fence about continuing. I think it depends on the kind of things people say about Ruthless Gods, because like I said, I really liked Seraphine, and I feel like with more world building, and if Nadia gets a good character arc later on in the books, like, I'm willing to give it a chance, but I think I'll probably wait until the trilogy is done. I really wanted to like this book, and it let me down. I didn't rate any books 3 stars this month, so I'm gonna move straight into my 4-star reads in the order that I read them. My first 4-star reads was Girls of Paper and Fire. I am a little bit whipped for queer romances because there's not enough of them, and I think that they can bring something very fresh to stale romance tropes, but that isn't enough for me to give a book 4 stars, because a bad queer romance is just as bad as a bad straight romance in a novel. But I thought it had a super healthy dynamic once the characters were together. They seemed to have a fairly healthy dynamic. There was some of that miscommunication trope, or like keeping secrets from one another, but it wasn't like in a manipulative way so much as like to protect each other. And I thought that they had good chemistry together, but it is a bit insta-lovey, and so I can understand why people did not like that part of the book, and it does take over the plot a little bit when it appears in the book, so I can understand also like people don't like those things. I thought it made sense for this book because it was a forbidden romance, and so that kind of thing tends to drive the plot forward in these types of books. And so once I saw where the relationship was going, I wasn't super surprised that it took over most of the plot, so I didn't mind. And I thought the world building and the magic were really interesting. They were based on Malaysian and Chinese culture because that is the author's heritage, and it's something I haven't seen a ton in YA fantasy, and so I was interested in it. And I personally liked the human, like the animal demon things, like you can be like either fully human or like part animal looking. If you're like the steel cast, you're like in between a human and a demon, and then you're the moon cast and you're like just an anthropomorphic animal. I think that's like an interesting basis to a class system. Something I've never seen done before is like this anthropomorphic animals are just like, that's the top tier because animals are stronger or whatever. And I also really appreciated that the relationship between our protagonist and her abuser is not romanticized, because the plot of Girls of Paper and Fire is that the protagonist, Lei, is taken to the court of the Demon King to be one of his concubines for the year, otherwise known as Paper Girls. And just trigger warnings, there is sexual assault in the novel. It's not incredibly blatant, but it is there, and so if you're incredibly sensitive to those things, just be aware that it's hinted at and implied, but you don't see it on the page. But the fact that it doesn't rely on Stockholm Syndrome that is romanticized as a loving relationship is really fresh, because I feel like there's a lot of series in which the girl falls in love with her abuser, and I was super glad that this didn't do that. So I gave it 4 stars. I really liked it. I'm excited to keep reading on with the series, seeing where it goes, how they deal with it. I was genuinely taken aback by the very ending of the book, so I'm like, what's gonna happen next? I really liked it. I didn't mind the insta-love all that much. It wasn't like my favorite thing, but I thought the relationship was cute enough and good enough, like had enough chemistry that I was like, yeah, okay, it's fine. It's fine. I can enjoy that. So I really liked Girls of Paper and Fire. The next 4-star read was a book that I actually thought I was going to give 5 stars, but I did not, and that is Alloy Law by Brandon Sanderson. This is the second Brandon Sanderson book I have not given 5 stars. The problem with Alloy Law is not inherent in the book itself whatsoever. There's actually very little I would complain about in the book itself. It's just that it comes after one of my favorite series of all time, with characters that I loved with my whole heart, that I was deeply connected to and very passionate about, and it is just not possible, I think, to read this book and not remember how much you loved the other characters, and kind of just wishing that instead of reading this, you were getting more stories about the characters that you already loved in this world. And I think that that is no fault of the book, but just I could not enjoy it as fully as I enjoyed Mistborn, because I am almost sullied by it and my love of Mistborn. But that being said, I will continue the series for sure, because I really liked Wax and Wayne, especially Wayne, and I really liked the female character, Marazi. I really liked Marasi, whatever how you say her name. I really liked her as well. I felt like our 3 main protagonists were really interesting. Brandon Sanderson writes a good fantasy, like, mystery plotline. He's good at mysteries. It just wasn't... I loved Vin and Ellen so much, and I loved Sazed, whatever, Breeze, Spook. I loved them so much that I felt at times I was reading more for references to them than I was for Wax, Wayne, or Marazi. And so I just couldn't give this full 5 stars. So I'm going to get into a little bit of spoilers for the book, just because it's hard to talk about what I liked about it without spoiling the relationship, even though I think it's friggin' obvious from the very beginning. But anyway, I'll put a timestamp on the screen for what to skip to skip the spoilers. And then the last book that I read this month, and also my last 4-star read, was To Kill a Kingdom by Alexandra Christo. I did not think I was going to like this book as much as I did. It was a really fast read, but it took me a while to get into it, and I don't know why. I think it's because I don't love retellings, and I'm pretty sure To Kill a Kingdom is a Little Mermaid retelling. There's just something about retellings that don't ever feel entirely fresh to me, which is nothing against people who write retellings. It's just it's my crime, my cross to bear. But I was proven wrong. I really liked To Kill a Kingdom. I really liked Lyra, and I liked Elian, and I liked, most of all, their relationship. And reading To Kill a Kingdom is what made me realize what the true problems in Furyborn are. Because the stakes in To Kill a Kingdom are not very high, and the plotline is really linear and very predictable. It really didn't shock me whatsoever at all. And that was fine, because I thought Lyra was an interesting character, Elian was interesting characters, the side characters were vaguely interesting, and I was committed to Lyra and Elian's relationship together, and their relationship to the outside characters, and their motivations and their goals. So, it didn't matter that the storyline was predictable and the stakes weren't very high. But because I cared about the characters, I kept reading. And I'll just say that Lyra and Elian have some of the best like chemistry and banter I have read between characters in a fantasy, like a YA fantasy, in a very long time. And they managed, Alexandra Christou, managed to do it in just a one-off standalone, as opposed to my preference for a slow burn over a longer series. So the fact that she managed to get me to love these characters' relationship and like fully support them and want to see them together at the end in just a relatively short standalone series is a testament to her skill to writing witty, funny banter from these two like absolute dicks of characters. Like Lyra and Elian are both just absolutely fucking horrible characters in the beginning, and they get better by the end, especially Lyra. But just their banter together and their like hate to love relationship and enemies to lovers in a very like understandable way, like as opposed to Wicked Saints, where I felt like I don't even understand why they're enemies in the beginning. It makes perfect sense why Lyra and Elian are enemies, and I then can see why their characters progress to fall in love. It was all around just a good read. So now I'm down to my 3 5-star reads. If you have been paying attention, you will know that both of my manga reads I read this month were 5-star reads for me, which I knew straight off the bat going into it. The first manga that I read this month was the second volume of Yona of the Dawn, which I knew before I even picked it up I was going to love. I really liked the anime adaptation, like the 24 episodes or whatever that were out, but I have been upset since I watched it that it doesn't have a second season, doesn't look like it's going to get a second season, and it doesn't really wrap up the story or any plot lines whatsoever. So I was like, I'm going to just read the damn thing. So that's what I'm doing, and I'm still reading the part in the volumes that I watched in the anime that I know I liked, so I knew it was going to be a 5-star read. The other manga that I read this month was the 8th volume of Yotsuba. Again, 5-star reads. I've obviously read 8 volumes of this, and it is just, I think I've said it before, the most feel-good, quick thing you could read, and just in one short chapter, take 20 minutes, you could like just completely change your mood, because the character of Yotsuba is impossibly endearing and so likable, so cute, and also like just she is just what a child that is 6 years old is like, and I love her so much. She's so funny, and the writing and the art style are simplistic, but just I laugh out loud every volume I read of this. I catch myself like actually like out loud laughing at the antics of this, and it's like a super fast read, and it's episodic, so every chapter is its own little contained story, and then there's like, you know, overarching like character threads weaving through, but you could, in reality, if you've read the first few chapters from the first volume, could then pick up any volume and read from there and probably not be lost. But obviously I would recommend just reading all of them in order, because it makes the most sense that way. But it's just, if you want something fast and easy to read to feel good about, Yotsuba. You don't have to buy it. If you don't have it at your library, just look for it online. It's so good. Then the only novel, like traditional novel that I read this year that was 5 stars was a reread, but I hadn't read it since I was probably in 5th grade, so maybe 10 years old, so I wasn't sure it was gonna be another 5-star read for me, because I loved it as a kid, but I haven't read it in like 14 years. I remember very little of the plot, but that was Goose Girl by Shannon Hale, and I knew as a child I absolutely freaking loved Shannon Hale, and I had recently been talking about to a friend about books that we really loved when we were younger, and we both were like, oh my god, Shannon Hale, Goose Girl, and I was like, I'm gonna reread Goose Girl, and I had forgotten so much of the plot of Goose Girl, I only remembered like up to the first like plot twist, and even then like I'd only remembered like bits and pieces of the beginning part. I remembered that plot twist because I remember like young Megan was like and like reading it again, I was like, wow, I was an idiot not to see that coming. They lay it out pretty clearly for you. And like in general, if you're older reading it, it's middle grade, bordering on young adult, and it's like quite linear. I think none of the plot twists are all that shocking if you are a slightly older reader, but like as a child I could not see any of that coming. But despite it being linear, I still really enjoyed the book. I thought it had a really healthy portrayal of a relationship, which I feel like a lot of early 2000s middle grades YA fantasy does not have. And it also portrayed like a really heartwarming female friendship, which again I feel like is kind of lacking from that era of YA fantasy. And maybe you would call Goose Girl middle grade, but either way, like I feel like that was like the era of like Twilight or whatever, and that female friendships weren't really a thing that were there and healthy, and I felt like the relationships at that time period were not incredibly healthy. But Goose Girl had both of those things, also a fairly interesting plot, and an incredibly interesting and unique magic system. I loved it. I barely remembered it, and I know I'm like a bit outside the age range for it, and it was still great. So that tells me that a book can be on the younger side, but as long as I know it's on the younger side going into it, I can still like it. So those were the 9 books I have read this month. I plan to read, hopefully, like more actual physical novels and not so much manga, just because there's a lot of actual, like, I don't want to like trash on manga, like I freaking love manga, but like traditional standard novels, there's like a ton that I want to read. So I'm hoping to read a bunch of them next month, but we'll see. We'll see. Because if I get one that I don't like, it makes it hard for me to keep pace. Because it's a slog. It's a slog. And I don't like to just, I don't know. Anyway, the next video up will probably be my February TBR. And then maybe a reading vlog of me reading To Kill a Kingdom and Wicked Saints. And voicing my opinions. So